When you begin the process of forgiving yourself, the very first step is often the most painful, but also the most necessary. You have to stop running from the shadow of your own past. Because whether you admit it or not, whether you've buried it under distraction, busyness, or denial, the mistakes you carry are still there, weighing on you. You feel them in the back of your mind when you lie down at night. You sense them when you hesitate to take a risk, when you shrink back from an opportunity, when you doubt yourself in moments where you should stand tall. That is the weight of guilt, the burden of shame, the unspoken truth that something inside you remains unresolved. And if you don't face it directly, it will keep showing up, shaping your choices, bending your posture toward life, convincing you that you are smaller than you really are. So the question is, will you keep hiding from it, or will you turn around and face it head on, because the only way forward is through? There's a kind of courage required here that most people never dare summon. It is the courage to admit with complete honesty, I did wrong, I hurt myself or I hurt others, I made choices that I am not proud of, and you don't soften it with excuses. You don't dilute it with justification, you call it for what it is. That truth might burn, but it purifies. Without that raw confrontation, there can be no forgiveness, only avoidance dressed up as strength. You see, guilt is not your enemy. It's a signal. It's your conscience reminding you that you're capable of more. But guilt left unattended mutates into shame, and shame convinces you that you are your mistakes. That's the difference. Guilt says, you did something wrong. Shame says, you are wrong. And shame will crush your spirit if you let it. That's why the act of acknowledgement is so important. By naming what you've done, you strip shame of its power. You bring it into the light, and suddenly it's not an invisible monster lurking in the dark. It's just a part of your story. Painful, yes, but not undefeatable. And don't fool yourself into thinking avoidance works. You can bury guilt, but it has roots. It grows underground, and it surfaces in unexpected ways, through anger, through self-sabotage, through the inability to look yourself in the mirror with clarity. Sooner or later, the bill comes due. You have to face it. The act of acknowledgement is a kind of self-respect. It's saying to yourself, I care enough about who I am becoming that I will not let the shadows of my past dictate my future. This is not weakness. This is strength. It takes more fortitude to admit the truth of your failures than to keep pretending they don't exist. And when you finally shoulder that responsibility, something remarkable happens. The weight begins to shift. It doesn't disappear overnight, but it becomes lighter because you're no longer dragging it unconsciously. You're carrying it deliberately, with awareness, and that transforms the burden into something you can work with, something you can learn from. Acknowledgement is the threshold of self-forgiveness. It is where the chains first loosen. And if you have the courage to take that step, to stop running, to face the mistakes of your past, and to admit their reality, you will begin to discover that you are stronger than the very weight you've been so afraid to confront, and once you lift that weight even slightly, you'll realize it never had to define you. It was only ever waiting for you to transform it. The first act of forgiving yourself is daring to look at your pain without flinching, and to decide, here and now, that it will no longer dictate the course of your life. It is so easy to believe that your worst moments are the sum total of who you are. You fail at something important, you betray your own values, or you let someone down. And then, in the silence that follows, a voice creeps in. It whispers, that's who you really are. You're a failure, you're a liar, you're weak. And if you listen to that voice long enough, it becomes a part of you. You start to walk as if your mistakes are tattooed across your forehead for the world to see. You define yourself by them, and in doing so, you shrink into the very box they create. But here's the truth. A mistake is an event. It's something that happened at a point in time. It is not the entirety of you. To define yourself by your failures is to confuse a single page of your story with the whole book. Imagine judging a novel by one sentence or a symphony by a single note. That would be absurd. And yet, so many people live as though the worst thing they ever did is the final word on who they are allowed to be. You have to understand this distinction. What you did and who you are not the same thing. Yes, your choices matter. They shape consequences. They ripple outward into the lives of others. But the capacity to choose again, to redirect, to rebuild, that is what makes you human. And that is why your mistakes cannot be the final verdict on your identity. Think about the people you admire most. Do you respect them because they lived flawless lives? Or do you respect them because they failed, they stumbled, they made grave errors, and yet, somehow, they rose again? The people who inspire us are not those untouched by weakness, but those who refused to be defined by it. They looked at the wreckage of their past and said, "This is not the end of me, this is the beginning of something else," and that decision changed everything. If you allow your mistakes to define you, you deny yourself the possibility of growth. You lock yourself in the prison of yesterday and throw away the key. But if you recognize your mistakes for what they are, lessons carved in stone, you gain something far more valuable than a clean record. You gain wisdom, you gain perspective, you gain a humility that grounds you and a strength that carries you forward. That's why forgiving yourself requires this mental shift. You stop saying, "I am my failures," and you begin saying, "I am the one who learns from them." This doesn't absolve you of responsibility. In fact, it heightens it. Because if you are not condemned to be the same as your mistakes, then you are responsible for proving that to yourself and to others through the way you live now. You can't hide behind shame and say, "This is just who I am." No, it's not. You are who you decide to become in the face of your mistakes. And let me tell you, when you stop identifying with your failures, you reclaim your agency. You reclaim the right to act differently today than you did yesterday. You reclaim the power to rebuild your character on stronger foundations, and that is where dignity comes from, not from perfection, but from perseverance. So when the voice of shame tells you that your mistakes are your identity, you need to silence it with this truth: you are not the worst thing you've done. You are the person capable of rising above it, and that rise, painful, difficult, imperfect as it may be, is what will define you in the end. One of the greatest traps people fall into after making mistakes is the belief that endless self-punishment is somehow noble, that if they suffer enough, if they berate themselves long enough, if they deny themselves joy and peace, then maybe, just maybe, they will atone. It feels like the right thing to do because guilt is heavy and shame is suffocating, and punishing yourself can feel like control. But the truth is, it isn't control at all, it's paralysis. It's a cycle that never ends because no amount of self-inflicted suffering can undo what has already been done. Think about it carefully. If self-punishment truly worked, then all the nights you spent tearing yourself apart in your own mind should have fixed things by now. All the years of regret should have healed the wound, should have erased the consequences, should have turned you into a better person automatically. But they haven't, have they? Because punishment doesn't transform, it corrodes. It eats away at the part of you that is capable of growth. It leaves you stuck, circling the same thoughts, trapped in the same emotional prison, unable to move forward. And it goes deeper than that. When you live in a state of constant self-condemnation, you are in effect saying, "I deserve no redemption. I deserve no second chance." You are denying yourself the very possibility of change. You are sentencing yourself to a life in which the future is no different from the past. That is not virtue, that is despair disguised as responsibility. Responsibility is when you acknowledge what you've done and then build a better life as a result. Despair is when you stay on your knees, never daring to rise, because you think punishing yourself is enough. But it isn't. There is a difference between guilt that guides and guilt that paralyzes. Healthy guilt says, I should not have done that. I need to learn. I need to make amends. I need to live differently. Unhealthy guilt says, I am broken beyond repair. I must keep suffering as proof. One leads to growth. The other leads to decay. The trick is to recognize when your self-reproach has stopped serving as a teacher and started chaining you to the floor. Life already punishes mistakes on its own. Reality has a way of making sure our wrongs carry consequences. You don't need to keep adding to them with a whip of your own making. What you need is not another layer of shame, but the courage to transform. The energy you waste beating yourself down could instead be used to rebuild trust with yourself and with others. The time you spend reliving your failures could instead be used to ensure they never happen again. That shift is what separates a life wasted in regret from a life redeemed by resilience. When you punish yourself endlessly, you're not paying a debt. You're digging a deeper hole, and no one climbs out of a pit by digging further. The only way forward is to drop the shovel, to stop insisting that more pain is the answer, and to start climbing toward light. Forgiveness is not about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about refusing to let your past keep you enslaved. The scars will remain, yes, but scars are not chains. They are reminders that you've survived, and survival means you are still capable of building something better. So stop mistaking suffering for redemption. Punishment does not cleanse the soul. Action does. Taking responsibility, making amends, choosing to live with greater integrity, and daring to grow into someone wiser than you were before. That is where transformation lies. And the moment you stop beating yourself down and start lifting yourself up, you'll discover a truth that changes everything. The road to redemption never begins with punishment. It begins with courage. When you look back at your life, there are moments that sting so sharply that even years later, the memory has the power to twist in your chest. The betrayal, the lie, the failure, the opportunity you wasted, it sits there, almost poisonous. And the danger is that instead of drawing strength from those memories, you allow them to fester, and they become venom in your bloodstream. They make you bitter, resentful, ashamed, and convinced that the past has the final word on your worth. But the truth is, those very same moments hold the seed of your greatest growth, if you have the courage to extract the lesson without swallowing the poison. Every mistake is a teacher. Life has this brutal, uncompromising way of showing you where you went wrong. It does not sugarcoat. It does not flatter. It confronts you with the cold, hard consequences of your choices. And in that confrontation there is always something to learn. Something about your character, about your limits, about your blind spots, about the way reality actually works. But too often, instead of asking, what can I take from this, we fixate on, why did this happen to me? Why am I such a failure? That's when the lesson gets lost and the poison takes hold. You cannot afford to drink the poison of regret endlessly. It weakens you, clouds your judgment, and paralyzes your will to move forward. You start carrying bitterness like a shield, as if resenting yourself or the world somehow protects you from making the same mistake again. But it doesn't. In fact, it blinds you further, because when you're consumed with bitterness, you stop seeing the truth that was hidden inside that failure. The wisdom is there, waiting, but you're too busy resenting to notice. So the task is this: learn to separate the lesson from the venom. Ask yourself honestly, what is this moment trying to teach me? Maybe it's teaching you about humility, that you aren't invincible, that you can be wrong. Maybe it's teaching you about responsibility, that your choices ripple outward further than you imagined. Maybe it's teaching you about patience or discipline, or the necessity of standing firm when it matters. But if you let the poison of shame drown you, you'll never uncover those truths. You'll keep repeating the same cycle because you never allowed yourself to see what the mistake was trying to show you in the first place. And here's the remarkable thing. When you extract the lesson, the failure stops being a weight and becomes a tool. What once dragged you down can now be the very thing that strengthens your steps. People who live with wisdom are rarely people who never failed. They are people who failed and refused to let the poison define them. They mined their pain for truth and carried that truth into the future. That's why their lives stand as testimony, not because they were perfect, but because they transformed their errors into guidance. You have the same choice. You can let your mistakes rot inside you, breeding regret and resentment, or you can wring them dry, take the wisdom they contain, and discard the poison. That doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means using it properly. A scar is not meant to keep bleeding. It is meant to remind you of what you've survived, and of the strength you've gained because of it. So the next time you are haunted by a memory of your failures, don't drink the poison. Don't let bitterness or shame be the thing you carry forward. Instead, ask what the experience is offering you. Take that lesson with gratitude and leave the rest behind. Because your past was never meant to be a prison. It was meant to be a teacher. And if you are wise enough to listen, it will guide you toward a future far greater than your failures. One of the hardest parts about forgiving yourself is realizing that the person you betrayed most deeply may not have been someone else. It may have been you. You promised yourself you'd do better, but you didn't. You swore you'd stay disciplined, but you quit. You told yourself you would never cross that line again, and then you did. Each time that happens, something inside you fractures. You stop believing in your own word. You stop trusting yourself. And when you can't trust yourself, it becomes nearly impossible to move forward with conviction, because every commitment feels like an empty gesture, every resolution like a lie waiting to reveal itself. That's why self-forgiveness cannot just be a matter of words. You can't stand in front of a mirror, declare, "I forgive myself," and expect to walk away healed. Words are cheap. Trust is earned, and if you've broken it with yourself, the only way to rebuild it is through consistent action. It's not dramatic. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly in the small decisions you make every day. When you keep your word to yourself, even in the smallest matters, you begin to repair the fracture. You start showing yourself that your promises mean something again. It begins with honesty. You have to stop setting grand, impossible expectations that you know you'll abandon in a week. That kind of overpromising and underdelivering is how you eroded your trust in the first place. Instead, start with something you know you can keep. If you say you'll wake up tomorrow and make your bed, then do it. If you say you'll write for 10 minutes, then do it. The scale doesn't matter. What matters is that your actions align with your words. Each time they do, a tiny piece of trust is restored. And over time, those pieces add up until you begin to stand taller, more secure in the knowledge that your word to yourself is solid. Of course, it's not just about discipline in habits. It's also about the deeper things. If you've lied to yourself about who you are, about what you want, about what you can tolerate, then rebuilding trust means telling yourself the truth. Maybe you've convinced yourself that you're fine in a situation that's slowly destroying you. Maybe you've pretended that a destructive pattern is just who you are. No. That's the lie that keeps the cycle turning. To rebuild trust, you must be brutally honest about what's not working and courageous enough to confront it. That honesty, painful though it is, lays the foundation for real self-respect. And with self-respect comes responsibility. Because once you begin to trust yourself again, you can no longer hide behind excuses. You can no longer pretend you're powerless. When you've proven to yourself that you can act with integrity, the weight of responsibility becomes unavoidable. But that's not a burden. It's freedom. It's the freedom of knowing that your life is no longer held hostage by your past mistakes. You've taken ownership, and you've shown yourself that you can be counted on. That's what forgiveness is meant to lead to. Not just relief from guilt, but restoration of strength. And when you rebuild trust with yourself, something remarkable happens. You stop fearing your own reflection. You stop running from the promises you've broken because you're too busy keeping the ones that matter now. You begin to walk with a steadiness that cannot be faked because you know deep down that your word is real again. Forgiving yourself means proving, through your actions, that you are worthy of trust. And when that trust is restored, you will find that the chains of your past no longer bind you, because you've become someone who can walk forward unshaken. At the heart of self-forgiveness lies a decision, and it is one of the most profound decisions you will ever make. Do you choose to live chained to the weight of your past, or do you choose freedom? Because make no mistake, those chains are real. They are built out of shame, guilt, and regret. Every time you replay the memory of your mistakes, every time you tell yourself that you are nothing more than your failures, you tighten the links around your own soul. You drag them through every relationship, every opportunity, every quiet moment alone with yourself. And over time, those chains convince you that you are powerless, that you are destined to remain bound forever. But here's the truth. The lock on those chains has never been outside of you. It has always been in your hands. You may not have chosen the mistakes you made. You may not have chosen the scars you carry, but you can choose what you do with them now. You can keep binding yourself to them, or you can decide in the deepest part of your being that they will no longer hold authority over your future. That is what freedom is, not erasing the past, but refusing to let it dictate who you are allowed to become. Freedom begins with responsibility. It means saying, yes, I did those things, yes, I made those mistakes, but I refuse to let them define the limits of my life. That's not denial, it's courage. It's the willingness to face reality and then to rise above it. Because the opposite of freedom is not just being stuck, it's surrender. It's handing your life over to shame and saying, you can have it. I'll stay here in the dark. That is a tragedy, not because your mistakes were unforgivable, but because you've given them more power than they deserve. When you choose freedom, you begin to notice something extraordinary. The chains don't disappear overnight, but they start to loosen. You begin to breathe a little deeper. You start walking a little taller. You begin to take risks again, not because you're reckless, but because you know you're no longer defined by the fear of failing. And with each step forward, the past loses more of its grip. It becomes part of your story, but no longer the script you're forced to follow. And let me tell you, freedom is frightening. Many people cling to their chains because at least they are familiar. There is a strange comfort in shame, in regret, in the constant replay of what went wrong. It gives you something to hold on to, something that excuses you from stepping into the uncertainty of a new future. But that comfort is a lie. It's the kind of comfort that keeps you small, keeps you weak, keeps you from living the life you were meant to live. To choose freedom means stepping into the unknown, carrying with you nothing but the wisdom your mistakes have given you, and trusting that you will be strong enough to face what comes next. That choice, to walk free, is the most powerful act of self-forgiveness you can make. It's the moment you stop bowing to the weight of your regrets and start living as if your life is still worthy of greatness, because it is. The past may have written its chapters, but the pen is still in your hand, and freedom means you are no longer chained to yesterday's pages. You are free to write the rest of the story. When all of this is gathered together, the message is simple, though not easy. You cannot keep living as a prisoner of your own past. To forgive yourself is not to excuse what you've done, nor is it to pretend the mistakes weren't real. It is to face them fully, acknowledge the weight you've carried, and then make the deliberate choice to rise above them. It is to see that your failures do not define you, that self-punishment is a dead end, and that every wound carries a lesson if you are willing to extract it. It is to prove, through action and honesty, that you can trust yourself again. And finally, it is to refuse the chains of regret and walk freely into the future that still belongs to you. If you can summon the courage to do that, then your past ceases to be a life sentence. It becomes a foundation. And on that foundation, you can build something stronger, truer, and more enduring than anything you've lost. Your redemption is not behind you. It is in every step you dare to take forward. Choose to take that step. Choose to live free.